This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 893 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. The term regression gets thrown around pretty loosely in the fantasy football space. If you've listened or read to fantasy content before, whether it's mine or not, you've likely heard the term. Regression is a return to a former or less developed state. In statistics, if one sample of a random variable is extreme, the next sampling of the same random variable is likely to be closer to its mean or its average. It's like when you go and play some golf. You usually shoot 90, and one day you shoot an 80. But you didn't do anything special that day. Maybe things just went your way. You should expect that number to regress back to your mean, which is 90, the next time you play some golf. Regression's everywhere in fantasy football. This is a numbers-driven game. It's also a game of small sample sizes. Some crazy things can happen in a 17-game sample. But we can use historical data to help us understand what's reasonably sustainable and what isn't. And that's what regression is all about in this game. It helps us understand if something is truly achievable, consistently achievable, or not. And that's important because a lot of times you'll find that fantasy managers sort of take what happened the previous season and they assume those same things are going to happen in the current season. But regression can help us see if the market is accounting for statistical volatility or not. So on today's show, I'll be talking through a handful of players from last year who should see some regression here in 2024. It's a show that I do each year, but it's a nice way to ease into drafts since a lot of you haven't really started your research yet. Now, before getting to the regression candidates, I just want to remind you that you can get a late round draft guide for absolutely free. Here's how it works. If you're new to Underdog Fantasy, go to underdogfantasy.com and sign up. Use promo code LATEROUND when you do so, and then make a deposit. After doing that, you'll get an email to your inbox from Underdog that has a link to the draft guide. That's a $25 value for absolutely free. You can save money by doing this, all while playing some best ball, which is obviously tons and tons of fun. The draft guide has everything you need to crush your drafts this year. About 80% of it is game theory driven, and the final 20% gets updated weekly. That 20% includes players to target, players to avoid, and late round dart throws. It also has my rankings and tiers, which now include auction values. You can purchase the guide for $24.99 on lateround.com, but you can get it for free, like I said, by heading to underdogfantasy.com and using promo code LATEROUND to sign up. That's promo code LATEROUND. I want to start with the San Francisco 49ers offense just in general today. I remember talking about them entering last year and saying how they were almost definitely going to see a dip in touchdowns per game in 2023, at least compared to how they performed with Brock Purdy in the regular season in 2022. And they did see a dip, actually. With Purdy in the regular season when he took over in 2022, the Niners averaged 3.83 touchdowns per game. That fell to 3.53 touchdowns per game in 2023. But they were still the best team at scoring touchdowns. I thought that they would be a little bit worse, so props to them. But with that being said, last season we had 3 teams hit 3.3 touchdowns per game or higher. The 49ers, the Lions, and the Dolphins. Over the last 12 years, there have been 26 teams with next season data to get to that 3.3 touchdowns per game mark. And of those 26, only one of them saw their touchdowns per game rate improve year over year. 11 of the 26 teams watched their touchdowns per game rate fall by a full touchdown. 20 of the 26 saw it drop by half of a touchdown. Half of a touchdown per game equates to 8.5 touchdowns across the season, which could be the difference in being a QB1 and a QB2 for a guy like Brock Purdy. So the 49ers have a very real chance to see fewer touchdowns this year. I still think they're going to be good, but I don't think we should assume complete and utter dominance. And that leads me to Brock Purdy. Purdy has started his career with a touchdown rate above 7%. His touchdown rate last year, 6.98%. So rounded up, it was 7%, which is wild. A 7% touchdown rate, which is just touchdowns divided by attempts, that's only been hit 17 times by a quarterback since 2011. That's basically between 1 to 2 of those seasons each year. And Brock Purdy's been above that mark through 21 regular season starts. Now, some might say, well, that's just his average. I don't buy that. For him to maintain that, he finished with the best touchdown rate in NFL history. I get that it's a good scheme and that he has incredible weapons, but there's clear regression coming his way. I think the market understands that to some degree, but based on Fantasy Pros rankings, I do think that he's a little bit overvalued. Now, all the while, one player who was helped out in that 49ers offense last year was Brandon Ayuk. And I like Ayuk the player a lot. I think he's a stud. But Ayuk did two things last year that are going to be hard to repeat. First, he had a 12.8 yards per target rate. Prior to 2023, he'd never been above 9.7 within that metric. Ayuk is the only player in NFL history, or at least since they started tracking targets, to hit 100 or more targets in a season and a yards per target rate above 12. And he was at 12.8. Chances are he won't be as efficient per target in 2024. It's just not very repeatable. So if he doesn't see a bump in volume, he'll likely be a slightly worse asset. Now, another big name fantasy player who could see some unfavorable regression this season is Josh Allen. Now, don't take this the wrong way. I still have Allen as my QB1, but I do think this needs to be shouted out today. Allen had 15 rushing touchdowns last year. Here are his rushing touchdown totals by year since entering the league. 8, 9, 8, 6, 7, and 15. Can you spot the outlier? According to Pro Football Focus's expected touchdowns model, Allen overachieved in the rushing touchdown column by 5.4 last year. That was the most in football at quarterback. It was more than Jalen Hurts, who had the unstoppable tush push. I think Allen is still deserving to be the QB1. I just don't think he's the obvious QB1, if that makes sense. I'd be shocked if he scored 15 rushing touchdowns again this year. You can't do a regression episode without talking about Devon Achane. Achane became the first player in NFL history last year to hit a 7.0 yards per carry average with 100 or more rush attempts. And his yards per carry was 7.8. If you look at an efficiency metric from 2023, among running backs, Achane likely is at the top of the list. And if you think about what he did mathematically, there's almost no chance he's going to repeat what he did year over year. Let me just give you a very easy example as to why. Since 2011, we've had well over 50 running backs hit 5 yards per carry in one season with 100 or more carries, and then see 100 or more carries the following year. So they had 100 carries one year, 100 carries the following year, and in that first season, their yards per carry was at or above 5. Of those players, only 12% of them increased their yards per carry the following season. And that's at 5 yards per carry. Devon Achane was at 7.8. This could be a case, though, where the consensus understands the regression is coming, so they price that into a player's cost. And I think that's happening to some degree with Devon Achane. Because what's the one thing that can combat a lack of efficiency? It's volume. And Achane has a real shot to see more volume, a higher percentage of Miami's backfield touches versus what he saw last year. So I'm actually more in than out with Achane this year because of that. We've seen his ceiling. I talk about that in the draft guide. But we have to recognize that this insane efficiency isn't going to maintain. And I didn't even talk about his touchdown numbers or Raheem Mostert's touchdown numbers, which are also likely going to regress. Garrett Wilson is getting a quarterback upgrade. So he's more than likely going to see better numbers in 2024 than he had in 2023. But 2023 was brutal based on his volume and where that volume was coming from. I think it's safe to say that it was more of a quarterback problem than anything else last year for Garrett Wilson. But Wilson finished about 3 touchdowns below expectation last year based on PFF's expected touchdowns formula. He scored 3 times. He could have easily doubled that number based on his volume and based on where he was seeing his targets. But that's not all on him. Wilson also played about 4 PPR points per game below expectation after seeing 168 targets. We don't often see high volume receivers give us such inefficiency. In fact, since 2011, we've had over 80 150 plus target wide receivers. Wilson was at 168 last year. Of those 80 plus wideouts, just 3 of them had a lower yards per target rate than Garrett Wilson last year: Jarvis Landry, Allen Robinson, and Larry Fitzgerald. We don't have next season data for Allen Robinson because he was hurt, but Landry followed up that inefficient year with a yards per target increase of 0.5. Fitzgerald increased his yards per target by 2 full yards. And for the record, Landry's volume didn't look anything like Wilson's did last year. His average depth of target was 6.3. Wilson's was 10.6. In other words, Landry's low average depth of target was helping the lower yards per target number. It's no surprise that Larry Fitzgerald's 2012 is on that list. Arizona used a combination of John Skelton, Kevin Cobb, Ryan Lindley, and Brian Hoyer at quarterback that year. That season, Fitz only had 4 touchdowns. The following year, on fewer targets with Carson Palmer, he scored 10. This is yet another team-level thing. The Jets were horrible last year converting touchdowns given the amount of offensive yards that they had. They scored a touchdown on every 254 yards. That's the 4th highest mark since 2011. That's a number that regresses year over year. There have been 10 teams with next season data who had a total yards to total offensive touchdowns ratio of 225 or greater. All but one of those teams improved that number the following year. The average increase in touchdowns per game among those teams was 0.68. So that would be 11 or 12 more touchdowns for the Jets here in 2024. Now, Larry Fitzgerald was deeper into his career at that point than Garrett Wilson is into his. But that does seem like a good year-over-year statistical comp for Garrett Wilson. We have to expect some favorable regression. There's a lot of warranted hype for Nico Collins right now, but I do want to pour a little cold water on it. Collins had an amazing 2023 season, but it also came with some unsustainable numbers. He ended up seeing a yards per target rate of 11.9. He had a yards per route run rate of 3.1. He was like a Brandon Ayuk light in terms of efficiency. Since 2011, there have only been 10 seasons where a wide receiver hit 100 or more targets and saw a yards per target rate above 11. You know how many of those players are on that list more than once? 0 of them. Because it's a really, really hard number to maintain. Now, the good part for Collins is that there's technically some room for improvement in the target share department. Collins had just a 21.9% target share per game rate last year. That's a good number, but it's not an elite number. Now, I know Stephon Diggs is in the mix now, but injuries and other contingent upside factors could get that number up by a percentage point or 2 for Collins in 2024. But he's definitely due for some regression. Those rate stats, whether we're talking about yards per target or yards per route run, they're almost definitely not going to maintain. And that's something to keep in mind during your drafts. Jerome Ford is also getting some love in the fantasy community this year because Nick Chubb is sidelined with that gruesome injury that he had last year. I'm more in the camp of, I don't totally understand the love for Jerome Ford. He had his opportunity last year without Nick Chubb in that lineup. Like, we saw what that looks like. And he was a low-end RB2 in PPR points per game. And Chubb has a chance to come back during the most important part of the fantasy season this year. Now, maybe you're bullish on the new look offense like I am. I can understand that. And Ford's a capable pass catcher. There could be a role there for him. But look at how he performed last year, and look at how it wasn't that sustainable, despite not even having amazing numbers. Ford scored 5 receiving touchdowns in 2023. That was roughly 3 receiving touchdowns above expectation. And then he also outperformed in rushing touchdowns by another score. So he played about 4 touchdowns above expectation in 2023. That's based on where he was seeing his touches in that Browns offense. Now, like any of the players who are regression candidates in efficiency, he could always look okay because of a volume increase, a hypothetical volume increase. But Ford was brutal at gaining positive yards last year. He had a bottom 15 number at the position among all backs who carried the ball 100 or more times since 2011. I've gotten Ford in some best ball drafts, but I'm not as bullish on him as some others are. And regression is part of the reason why. Someone who's pretty polarizing right now, and honestly, I don't have a super strong opinion here, just for the record. But that polarizing player is Javonte Williams. There was a report out last week about how the last running back roster spot on the Broncos could come down to Williams and Samaje Perine. And while I don't personally think that Williams is going to get cut, the fact that there's talk about it, that can't be a good thing. Williams, though, clearly had some stuff working against him last year. Number one being his recovery from his knee injury. Literally across the board, Williams saw worse numbers in 2023 than he had seen in 2022 and 2021. His yards per carry was down by like 0.8 yards. His rate of getting 10 plus yards was under 10% for the first time in his career. He gained 20 or more yards on less than 1% of his rushes, another career low. But Williams' usage really wasn't as bad as people realize. We all know that Sean Payton loves using his running backs out of the backfield as receivers. He owns 8 of the top 20 seasons since 2011 in team running back target share, which is absolutely insane. Williams himself averaged a target share per game rate above 12% last year. He just wasn't efficient, and he failed to register touchdowns. He underperformed in the touchdown column by almost 3 scores, and his PPR points per game number was roughly 2.6 points lower than expected. Part of the reason for that is what we saw at the team level. A lot of this stuff starts at that team level. Denver, with Russell Wilson, scored over 77% of their touchdowns last year through the air. That's a number that, based on history, we would expect to drop by 12 or 13 percentage points year over year. If you were to guarantee me Javonte Williams' exact same workload this year, the same one that he saw last year, I actually think that he might be an underrated asset. There are just things working against him right now with Jaleel McLaughlin, who I love, and then Audric Estime. And as a result, Javonte Williams is not an easy target, but he is a regression candidate. The last player I want to get to today, and there are tons of players that we could talk about, but the last one is Sam Laporta. Usually you don't get a regression candidate or an unfavorable regression candidate from a rookie player going into his second year. But Laporta played on a Lions offense that scored a lot of touchdowns last year. And like San Francisco, they probably won't have as many touchdowns this year, just based on what we've seen go down historically. Laporta ended up scoring over 3 more touchdowns than he was expected to last year. So a drop in overall team offensive touchdowns could have a sincere impact on his bottom line here in 2024. I mean, he scored a touchdown on every 12 targets last season. Since 2011, only Rob Gronkowski, Jimmy Graham, and Travis Kelce have been able to post multiple seasons where their targets to touchdowns rate was 15 or lower. Kelce has only done it twice. I do think Laporta is special, and that he's probably going to be the next elite tight end in fantasy football if he's not already there. So don't take this as a dig on him. I love him as a player. It's just that more often than not, he's probably not going to score at the clip that he scored at last year. And that's a differentiator for me between Laporta and Travis Kelce this year. The Chiefs are bound to score a lot more touchdowns in 2024. The Lions might have a harder time maintaining where they were at in 2023. And that can be the difference. Now, obviously, there are so many more candidates that I could have gotten to today, but I wanted to point out some of the more intriguing ones. Hopefully, it made you think about these guys a little bit differently. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. And make sure you're subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football YouTube channel. I've been doing a lot of live stream drafts over there, and every time I go live, you get notified. So subscribe, youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll be back tomorrow with another episode of Becoming a Best Ball Bro.